Denver, Colorado. The late afternoon sun pushed through the tall windows of the law office, throwing golden streaks across the polished oak table. My hands rested flat against the surface, steady but
We should
cold.
proceed with the full discovery process.
I was 67 years
I agree
old,
completely.
a retired construction engineer, and for most of my life I'd been treated like the quiet shadow in my own family story. Across from me, my son Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, with that smirk I'd come to know too well. 38 years old, sharp suit, expensive watch, hair cut with precision. He looked every bit the heir to his mother's empire. He didn't glance at me, not once. His eyes stayed fixed on the attorney, as if I were nothing more than an unwanted guest who had stumbled into the wrong room. "You don't have to drag this out," Ethan said, a low chuckle escaping his throat. "We all know how this ends. Mom left everything to me. Dad gets nothing." The words hung heavy in the air. I felt them, sharp and deliberate, meant to cut. He'd said similar things before, at dinners, in hallways, whispered to relatives who nodded and agreed. But here, in this room, it carried a different weight. This was final. The lawyer, a man in his 50s named Howard Briggs, cleared his throat. His fingers tapped the edge of a thick folder stamped with the seal of the state of Colorado. I could see his eyes flick toward me for just a moment, as if bracing for what he was about to unleash. Howard began reading. The cadence of his voice was formal, steady, but then, just a few sentences in, he paused. The pause was long enough to pull Ethan forward in his chair, the smug grin faltering ever so slightly. "To my former husband, Richard Coleman," Howard read, his tone sharpening. "I leave a portion of my estate under terms to be specified." The smirk vanished. Ethan's face hardened, color draining from his cheeks. His chair scraped loudly against the wood floor as he jerked upright. In that moment, the room shifted. For decades, I had been dismissed, underestimated, erased. But as those words rolled out, I knew everything was about to change. I had been cast aside by my own family. That day, I made myself a promise. They would never overlook me again. When I walked out of that office in Denver years before, clutching the thin envelope that marked the end of my marriage, I thought I had already lost everything. But life has a way of showing you just how much lower you can go before the ground finally steadies beneath your feet. I settled in Boulder, Colorado, in a one-story house tucked between foothills and old cottonwood trees. The place wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, squeaky floors, a porch that sagged on the left side. But it was mine. After 25 years of marriage, it was all I had left. A roof, a battered pickup truck, and the kind of quiet that only comes after the storm has passed. Linda, my ex-wife, went the other direction entirely. While I adjusted to grocery, budgets, and fixing my own plumbing, she was climbing. Her real estate business, which she had started while we were still together, took off after the divorce. She bought properties across Colorado, flipped entire neighborhoods, and built what people came to call the Coleman Group. Articles in the Denver Post praised her vision. Local television stations featured her as the woman who turned rocky soil into gold. By the time she was 50, her net worth stretched well into the tens of millions. I remember watching her on the evening news once, standing in front of a gleaming glass tower her company had just finished downtown. She wore a navy suit, her smile sharp, her voice steady as she talked about creating a legacy for future generations. I muted the television before Ethan could hear it. Ethan, our son. He was only 20 when the divorce papers were finalized, but old enough to choose sides. And he did, without hesitation. Linda had the money, the power, the shine. I was just the man who came home in dusty boots and talked about concrete curing times and rebar placement. To Ethan, that life looked small. I'll never forget the night it became painfully clear. It was our 25th wedding anniversary, back before the marriage had cracked wide open. Linda had rented a banquet hall in downtown Denver, invited more than 100 guests, business partners, friends, extended family. Crystal glasses sparkled under chandeliers. Waiters glided with trays of champagne. I wore my only suit, feeling out of place, as if I had wandered into someone else's dream. During the toast, Linda spoke of ambition, of building a future, her eyes gleaming with plans that no longer included me. Then Ethan, drunk on champagne and youthful arrogance, raised his own glass. He was barely 21. His words cut through the laughter like a blade. "Here's to Mom," he said, "the one who built all of this. And Dad, well, you'll never be more than a handyman." The room erupted with uneasy laughter, some forced, some genuine. I froze, the glass in my hand trembling. Linda didn't correct him. She didn't defend me. She just smiled, like the insult was some harmless joke. But it wasn't harmless. It was the moment my son, my own flesh and blood, told the world who he believed I was, and who I would never be. The scar of that night never fully healed. After the divorce, Ethan drifted further into his mother's world. Expensive suits, networking dinners, business school in Chicago. Every holiday he visited Linda's estate, where imported wine and high ceilings replaced the simple dinners we once had around a scratched wooden table. When he came to see me, on the rare occasions he did, his eyes scanned my modest home like he was stepping into a museum of failures. "Dad," he'd say, sighing as if my existence embarrassed him, "you could have done so much more with your life. Mom saw opportunities. You just poured concrete. Just poured." I'd bite back the anger. I'd tell myself that one day he'd understand that building bridges and hospitals mattered as much as buying skyscrapers. But deep down, I knew he didn't want to understand. Stories like mine aren't rare in this country. Families torn apart by ambition, by money, by the uneven weight of success. In 2021, I read about a case in California where 3 siblings went to court, tearing each other apart over their father's $40 million estate. USA Today covered it like a spectacle. Brothers and sisters who hadn't spoken in years, suddenly standing across from each other in front of a judge, screaming over who deserved what. America pretends inheritance is about legacy, but in reality, it's often about old wounds and the sharp edge of resentment. I saw myself in that story. A father forgotten, dismissed, made into a ghost, while others carved their names into history. And yet, even as Linda's empire grew and Ethan's contempt hardened, I kept my silence. I fixed leaky faucets, paid my bills on time, and lived a life no one cared to notice. Until now. Because as I sat in that Denver law office hearing the lawyer's voice cut through Ethan's laughter, I realized my story wasn't over. The world thought I was finished. My son believed I would die with nothing to my name. But the ground was shifting, and for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of something more than survival. I felt the first crack of power returning to my hands. It was a winter evening in Denver, a few years before Linda's death. Snow pressed against the windows of her mansion in Cherry Creek, muffling the sounds of the city. The house glowed with the kind of warmth only money could buy. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, leather chairs polished to perfection. I was there at Linda's request, though I suspected Ethan had arranged it. She wanted to keep things civil, as she put it, even though civility between us had long since vanished. Ethan hovered close to her that night, wearing a tailored gray suit, glass of scotch in hand, like a prince waiting to claim his throne. Dinner was a quiet affair. Linda spoke mostly about business deals, new developments in Aspen, a partnership with an investment group from New York. I pushed food around my plate, nodding at the right moments, feeling as though I had stumbled into someone else's family gathering. When Linda excused herself to take a phone call, Ethan and I were left alone in the cavernous dining room. The silence stretched. His eyes slid toward me, sharp and calculating. "You know, Dad," he began, his voice smooth but edged with steel, "when she's gone, everything will be mine. You don't deserve a dime." The words were simple, but they cut deeper than anything he'd ever said before. I looked at him, at my own son, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. His face carried Linda's sharpness, her ambition, but none of the softness he once had as a boy. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike on a cracked sidewalk in Boulder, his small hands gripping the handlebars, the way he'd shouted, "Don't let go, Dad." Now he was grown, a man of wealth and pride, telling me I had no worth in his eyes. I didn't answer. I sat in silence, my chest tight, my fingers curling against the arm of the chair. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his voice as though savoring the cruelty. "You've always been a disappointment. Mom built everything. You poured concrete and acted like it mattered. But it didn't. She made millions. You made excuses. Don't fool yourself. When the will is read, you won't even be mentioned." The chandelier light caught in his glass as he took another sip, his smile hard and confident. Something inside me cracked. For years I had endured the quiet humiliations, the sideways glances, the dismissive laughter, the way Linda introduced me as if apologizing for my existence. But hearing it from Ethan, spoken so plainly, was different. It was final. I stared down at my plate, watching the reflection of the chandelier tremble in the untouched wine. My throat felt raw, as though I'd swallowed glass. For a moment I wanted to fight back, to tell him he was wrong, to remind him of nights I carried him to bed, of the hours I worked to pay for his school clothes, of the sacrifices Linda never had to make, because I was the one holding everything together in the shadows. But I didn't, because the truth was staring me in the face. In his world, I didn't matter. And in that silence, as Ethan's voice dripped with contempt, I realized something. If my own son could erase me this easily, then I had already lost everything that could be taken from me. What remained was something he couldn't touch. Dignity. That night, as I drove back to Boulder, the snow swirling under the headlights of my old truck, I replayed his words again and again. "You don't deserve a dime." The insult burned, but beneath the pain, something colder, steadier began to form. I would not allow myself to be humiliated forever. I had been silent for too long, and if Ethan believed I was nothing, then I would show him, show all of them, that even a man cast aside still had a voice strong enough to shatter the silence. Driving home that night through the storm, Ethan's words followed me like shadows in the headlights. "You don't deserve a dime." I repeated them until they lost shape, until they became less of a wound and more of a warning. For years, I had accepted humiliation in silence. But silence, I realized, was its own kind of prison. The next morning, I walked into my small study in Boulder. It wasn't much. A metal desk scarred with coffee rings, a filing cabinet that groaned when you pulled its drawer too far, shelves lined with old engineering manuals and photographs yellowing in their frames. I sat down, opened the cabinet, and pulled out the folders I had avoided for too long. Divorce papers, tax forms, deeds, memories I had locked away like dangerous tools. I spread them across the desk, the smell of dust rising as if the past itself had been disturbed. My fingers lingered on one deed in particular, an acre of land on the outskirts of Boulder, long ignored, forgotten by Linda when she divided up our lives. Back then it wasn't worth much, just a stretch of rocky soil with stubborn weeds. But Boulder had changed. The city had grown, developers hungry for every parcel they could get their hands on. That little acre now carried value. I made calls, quiet ones, no announcements, no hints to Ethan or anyone else. Within weeks, the land was sold to a small builder eager to expand. The check I held in my hand afterward wasn't enormous compared to Linda's fortune, but it was mine. Clean, untouched by her empire. And I knew exactly what to do with it. I walked into the office of Catherine Morales, an attorney recommended by an old friend at the construction firm where I'd spent most of my career. She specialized in estate disputes, the kind of lawyer people called when family turned into enemies. She looked me over with the measured eyes of someone who had seen too many men like me, worn down, doubted, but still clinging to something worth fighting for. "I don't know what's coming," I told her, sliding the envelope of documents across her desk. "But I know I need someone in my corner." She nodded. No judgment. Just a quiet agreement. For the first time in years, I felt less alone. That night, back in my house, I pulled out an old shoebox from the closet. Inside were letters, Linda's handwriting, sharp and precise from the early years of our marriage. Promises scribbled on lined paper, grocery lists with little hearts drawn in the margins. Apologies written after arguments we thought would destroy us, but never did. I sat with them for a long time, memories pressing in on me like the weight of an unfinished building. Then I carried the box out to the backyard. The winter air stung my lungs as I struck a match. Flames caught quickly, curling the paper into black fragments that floated upward into the night. I watched until the last scrap crumbled to ash. It wasn't hatred that drove me. It was release. For the first time, I felt the past loosen its grip. Linda no longer held me captive. Neither did Ethan. The fire hissed low in the snow-dusted wind, and I whispered to the dark, almost to myself, "This time, I won't be silent." The weeks after I burned Linda's letters felt strangely quiet, like standing in the eye of a storm. Ethan must have sensed something shifting, though he couldn't see it. He came to my house one Sunday afternoon with a briefcase and that familiar look of impatience. "Dad," he said, dropping papers on my kitchen table, "we need to get some signatures in order. Mom's estate is complicated. Taxes, transfers, you wouldn't understand. Just sign where I tell you, and it'll make everything smoother when the time comes." He didn't bother to hide the condescension in his voice. To him, I was still the handyman, the relic, the obstacle standing between him and what he believed was his birthright. I picked up the papers, flipping through them slowly. Numbers, clauses, terms that smelled of traps. I nodded like I always had, letting him believe I was compliant. "I'll look them over," I said, keeping my tone even. You don't need to look them over, Ethan replied sharply. That's why I'm here. I'm making sure you're taken care of. Just trust me. I forced a smile, sliding the papers back toward him. I do trust you, son. Let me just read through these tonight, and I'll sign. He didn't like that. His jaw tightened. Don't drag your feet, Dad. This is important. The longer you take, the more complicated it gets. We need to make sure everything is ready when, well, you know, when she's gone. The words sat between us like a coffin. He couldn't even say when Mom dies. Just when she's gone, like her absence was already a business plan. After he left, I placed the documents in a folder and drove straight to Catherine Morales' office. She was waiting, her dark hair tied back, glasses perched low as she sifted through legal briefs. He's trying to get me to sign these, I told her, laying the papers on her desk. I don't know all the details, but it feels wrong. She read in silence, her eyes narrowing. It is wrong, she said finally. He's preparing transfers that would strip you of any claim before the will is even executed. If you signed, you'd be giving up rights you don't even realize you have. The weight of her words settled heavy in my chest. Ethan wasn't just arrogant. He was deliberate, willing to erase me with the stroke of a pen. Catherine looked at me carefully. The best thing you can do right now is keep pretending. Play along. Let him think you're going along with it. And meanwhile, we build our case. Every document, every conversation, every insult, write it down. Keep a record. And so I did. For the first time in years, I felt myself shifting. I was no longer the old man waiting for scraps. I was watching, recording, preparing. Each phone call, each demand Ethan made, I wrote down in a notebook I kept in my nightstand. Every time he belittled me, I added the date, the words, the witnesses. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming control. Ethan, of course, only grew bolder. At a dinner with Linda's business partners, he made a show of it. I'd been invited out of courtesy, I suppose, a token gesture to the man who used to be her husband. The table was full of men in suits and women in silk dresses, their conversations laced with money and power. Ethan raised his glass. My father, he said, gesturing to me with a smirk, spent his life building other people's projects. Solid work, I'm sure, but let's be honest. He never built anything that lasted. Mom, on the other hand, created an empire. That's what I plan to continue. That's the future. Laughter rippled around the table. Not cruel, but complicit. The kind of laughter that agreed without having to think. I sat there, my face burning, but I didn't speak. I just watched him, the way his eyes glimmered when he thought he'd put me in my place. What he didn't know was that I had stopped feeling humiliated. Instead, I was memorizing every detail, filing it away like bricks stacked for the foundation of something bigger. On the drive home, Catherine's words echoed in my head. Play along. Build the case. And something else stirred inside me. Something I hadn't felt in decades. Determination. I was no longer the man Ethan dismissed. I was no longer Linda's forgotten ex-husband. For the first time, I felt like the architect of my own story. And soon, Ethan would learn that underestimating me was the costliest mistake he had ever made. The day of Linda's funeral felt heavy, not just with grief, but with the weight of unfinished wars. The chapel in Denver had been filled with polished shoes, black suits, and whispered condolences. I stayed in the back pew, invisible as always, while Ethan stood at the front like a king inheriting his crown. When the service ended, people drifted toward the reception hall attached to one of Linda's properties, a sprawling event center she had purchased years ago, a place designed to impress. Chandeliers glowed above marble floors, waiters passed out champagne, and conversations turned quickly from mourning to speculation. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next with the Coleman Group. I hadn't planned to attend the reception, but something inside me wouldn't let me leave. Not yet. I slipped into the crowd, unnoticed, a gray suit among diamonds and silk. Then Ethan took the stage. He tapped the microphone once, the chatter fading to silence. His voice carried across the hall, confident, almost rehearsed. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate my mother's remarkable life," he began. "She was a visionary, a pioneer, and she built this company from the ground up. I intend to honor her legacy by stepping into her place as CEO of the Coleman Group." Applause broke out, brief and polite. I saw heads nodding, glasses raised. For them, it made sense. He was Linda's son, groomed for this moment. But Ethan wasn't finished. His eyes swept the room until they found me at the edge of the crowd. A smile crept across his face, cold, deliberate. "There's one thing I'd like to make clear," he continued, his gaze fixed on me. "My mother built her empire alone. She did it without help, without support from those who should have stood beside her. Some people in this room know exactly who I'm talking about." Murmurs stirred through the crowd. I felt every eye shift toward me, the old familiar burn of judgment settling on my skin. "My father," Ethan said, his voice sharp now, "spent his life pouring concrete, fixing pipes, doing work anyone could have done. He never contributed to my mother's success. Not one brick of her empire came from him. And now, as we look to the future, I want it understood. He has no place in this company, or in the legacy she created." Laughter rippled, nervous but real. Some people looked away, others nodded in quiet agreement. Ethan stood tall, basking in the power of the moment, certain he had put me back in the box where I belonged. I didn't move. My hands stayed folded in front of me, my face calm. Inside, though, a different fire burned. Not humiliation this time, but resolve. Because what Ethan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already taken steps he couldn't imagine. Catherine had the documents, the evidence, the pieces of a puzzle Ethan thought he controlled. I had played the role of the silent, defeated father for long enough. I let him finish his speech, let the applause wash over him like the coronation he craved. Then I turned and walked quietly out of the hall, past the waiters and the chandeliers, into the crisp evening air. The cold hit my lungs like steel, but it steadied me. This was no longer just about money or inheritance. It was about dignity, about drawing a line no one would cross again. Ethan had chosen to humiliate me in front of everyone. What he didn't understand was that public humiliation cuts both ways, and soon it would be his turn. 3 weeks after the funeral, the summons came, the reading of Linda's will. The setting was Briggs & Morales, a law firm in downtown Denver with vaulted ceilings, polished wood paneling, and the kind of quiet that made every step echo like a verdict. Catherine walked with me, her presence steady, a silent reminder that I wasn't walking into this alone anymore. Ethan was already there when we arrived, seated in a leather chair at the head of the long conference table. He wore another tailored suit, dark blue this time, and his confidence filled the room like cologne. His legs crossed, hands folded, expressions smug. He didn't even glance at me, just muttered, "Let's get this over with." Howard Briggs, the attorney who had read the opening lines weeks before, shuffled a thick file and cleared his throat. His voice carried the authority of the state of Colorado and the finality of death itself. "The last will and testament of Linda Coleman," he began. "Executed 6 months prior to her passing, duly witnessed and notarized." Ethan leaned forward, eyes shining. I sat back, hands clasped, heart steady but heavy. Howard continued, his tone precise. "To my beloved son, Ethan James Coleman, I leave the residence located at 421 West Pine Street, appraised at approximately $2 million, including all furnishings therein. Additionally, I bequeath the sum of $1 million in cash to be transferred from my secondary account within 90 days of probate." Ethan's smile widened, his chin lifting ever so slightly. He glanced at me then, just long enough to let me see the glimmer of triumph in his eyes. It was the look of a man who believed the game was already won. But Howard wasn't finished. He turned to the next page, his tone unbroken. "To my former husband, Richard Coleman." The air seemed to thicken. My breath caught. Ethan's smirk faltered just slightly. "Bequeath the remainder of my estate, including but not limited to all primary investment accounts, securities portfolios, real estate holdings, and controlling interest in the Coleman Group and all subsidiary companies. Estimated value, $47 million. The words dropped into the silence like a hammer on glass. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ethan shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward into the wall. His face turned red, then white, then red again, as if his body couldn't decide which emotion to settle on. "This is a joke!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "This has to be a mistake. My mother would never leave everything to him." Howard adjusted his glasses calmly. "I assure you, Mr. Coleman, there is no mistake. These were Linda's explicit instructions." "Explicit instructions?" Ethan spat. "He manipulated her. That's the only explanation. He poisoned her against me." I sat still, my hands trembling in my lap. I hadn't said a word. Catherine's hand touched my shoulder, grounding me. Howard raised a hand. In anticipation of this very dispute, Mrs. Coleman left additional documentation. He reached into the folder and withdrew a flash drive. With deliberate movements, he connected it to a screen mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life. And then Linda appeared. She sat in what looked like her study, hair neatly pulled back, voice steady. It wasn't the woman I remembered from our early days, nor the titan of real estate who had conquered Denver's skyline. It was something in between. Older, wiser, still fierce, but with a softness I hadn't seen in decades. "If you're watching this," she began, "then I am gone." I wanted my words, not just my lawyers, to explain my choices. Ethan's body stiffened, his breathing sharp and audible. "Richard," she said, her eyes fixed on the camera, "you never asked me for wealth. You never asked for more than a life together. Even when I chose ambition over us. You carried your burdens quietly, and though I didn't see it then, I see it now. That is why I trust you to handle this wisely." My vision blurred. Tears burned at the edges of my eyes, but I forced myself to stay composed. Then she turned slightly, her gaze shifting. Ethan, my beautiful boy, I know you are angry. I know you believe this is unfair. But listen to me. You have lived in my shadow, accepting the benefits of my labor without ever learning the responsibility that comes with it. You must build your own life. You must learn what your father already knows, that dignity is worth more than fortune. Ethan shook his head violently. No, she wouldn't say this. This is edited, fabricated. But the video continued. Linda's voice filled the room with a finality that silenced even him. This is not punishment. It is love, given in the hardest way I know how. Richard will guide the company because he will never abuse it. And Ethan, you will find your own strength once you realize wealth cannot define you. This is my final wish. The screen went black. Silence crushed the room. The only sound was Ethan's ragged breathing, like an animal cornered. Around us, witnesses, paralegals, assistants, Catherine herself, stared with wide eyes. The truth was undeniable. Ethan broke first. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling water glasses. This isn't over. I'll contest it. I'll take him to court. I'll prove she was coerced. Howard's tone sharpened. Mrs. Coleman underwent a full psychological evaluation prior to signing. Competency was confirmed beyond question. The video was recorded under the supervision of 2 independent witnesses. Legally, this will is ironclad. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at me, his eyes blazing with fury, betrayal, desperation all tangled together. You don't deserve this, he hissed. You don't deserve any of it. For the first time in years, I held his gaze without flinching. I didn't ask for it, Ethan, but your mother trusted me. That's something you'll have to live with. The words struck harder than I expected. He recoiled as if slapped, his body shaking. Around us, the room frightened still, every eye on him. The humiliation was complete. Because here, in the very place he had expected to be crowned, the truth had stripped him bare. And for the first time, Ethan understood. He had lost. Ethan stormed out of the conference room, his footsteps echoing down the polished hallway like thunder. He didn't wait for the final signatures, didn't acknowledge the lawyers or the witnesses. The door slammed behind him, leaving a vacuum of silence. I sat still for a moment, breathing deeply. The weight of $47 million and an empire I never wanted settling heavily on my shoulders. But heavier than all of it was the image of my son, broken, humiliated, stripped of the arrogance that had once seemed indestructible. I didn't feel victory. Not exactly. What I felt was release. For years, Ethan's words had been chains. You don't deserve a dime. You'll never be more than a handyman. Now those chains were gone. Catherine placed a hand on my arm. It's over, Richard. He can't touch this. I nodded. Maybe. But this isn't about beating him. It never was. I left the office quietly, stepping into the bright Colorado afternoon. The mountains rose in the distance, solid and unmoving, the same ones I had built roads and bridges across during my working years. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel small standing beneath them. Over the months that followed, the money passed into my accounts. The company formally shifted under my name. The management team, seasoned and loyal to Linda's vision, assured me they could handle the daily operations. I believed them. My role wasn't to pretend to be a mogul. My role was to decide what legacy would outlast me. So I created the Coleman Scholarship Fund at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Scholarships for students in civil engineering and construction management. Young men and women who, like me, believed that laying foundations, building bridges, and pouring concrete mattered just as much as glass towers and million-dollar deals. The press covered it, of course. Headlines praised the unexpected generosity of Linda Coleman's ex-husband. But I didn't do it for the headlines. I did it because I wanted those students to know what Ethan had never understood. That dignity is found in the work, not in the applause. I never spoke to Ethan again, though I heard through whispers that he had tried and failed to rally support for a legal challenge. No one listened. His name became less associated with promise and more with entitlement. And in a way, I pitied him. He had lost more than money. He had lost himself. One evening, I stood outside my modest house in Boulder, the same place I had retreated to after the divorce. The porch still sagged, the paint still peeled, but it was mine. The scholarship letters from grateful students lay stacked neatly on my desk inside. The sun dipped behind the Rockies, painting the sky in fire and ash. I drew a long breath, the crisp air filling my lungs, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. For the first time since Ethan's cruel words in that banquet hall so many years ago, I smiled, not in defiance, not in triumph, but in quiet acceptance. I was no longer the man who had been erased. I was Richard Coleman, and I was finally free.